Welcome. I'm Devesh Kapur, the Director of Asia Programs at SAIS. Before we start on today's event, I just want to point out to you all the next event which we have on October 14th. It's titled How Will Indian Americans Vote? And it's based on a nationally representative survey that was carried out in the first half of September. On the chat box, you'll see a link and you can register for that event if you'd like to attend. So, so back to our sort of event, amid the COVID crisis, the accompanying economic crisis, and a difficult US elections, there's something else happening in another part of the world. There's a major face-off between China and India, sort of in the Himalayas. What exactly happened, why it happened, and where this might be headed? We have two excellent speakers to help us understand these very difficult questions. Ajai Shukla, who is a consulting editor and columnist for a major Indian financial daily called Business Standard, and a retired Indian Army colonel, and Yoon Sun, who she's a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. They'll both each speak for about 20 minutes. I'll then ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. If you have questions, please send them sort of in the Q&A box. So now I'll turn to our speakers. We'll begin with Ajay, and then he'll be followed by Yoon Sun. So Ajay, the floor is yours.
Okay. Let me start by putting on my slides. I hope everybody can see that, but I'm just going to assume they have. So Devesh, let me start by thanking you and thanking SAIS for inviting me to this session. It's a great honor and privilege to be here and to share the stage with Yoon Sun, who is very widely read in India. We've sort of all read her, and it's my first chance to actually be on a panel with her. So thank you all very much. Let me start by saying that this title, The Fraught Face-Off in the Himalayas, the face-off is not actually taking place in the Himalayas. Just let me get my slides moving. Okay, so Ladakh, where this face-off is actually taking place, is well beyond the Himalayas. You cross the Himalayas when you move from Kashmir in a northeasterly direction. Then you cross another mountain range called the Zanskar range. Then you cross the Ladakh range or the Kailash range, depending on which direction you're moving. And then you reach this face-off site, which is where the line of actual control between India and China is taking place. It's located on what I would call India's slice of the Tibetan plateau. This is a sort of a screen. On your screens, you'll be seeing the Pangong Lake. This is really the beginnings of the Tibetan plateau. So this is what gives this whole area strategic value for India. This is what makes China feel vulnerable about India's presence, because India is actually not the other side of the Himalayas here, but across the Himalayas in the Tibetan plateau on a mountain range called the Karakoram. So with your permission, I'll change the title of the talk to A Fraught Face-Off between India and China in the Karakorams. Let me go on from there and quickly recapitulate, just for the benefit of this audience, many of whom would already be knowing all these details. But just to bring everybody onto the same grid, action here started off on exact date is available, April the 19th, when intelligence reports from the Indian side unveiled that the People's Liberation Army, the PLA of China, was carrying out a major military exercise across the line of actual control. In the Aksai Chin area, near Depsang, near Chushul, near Demchok, all of them are marked on the map. There was not a lot of alarm on the Indian side because these exercises are routinely held when winter starts giving way to spring. The two armies on either side dust themselves out from their winter hibernation. They come out, they get their equipment out, they check out, and then everybody goes back to their barracks and it's business as usual after that. Except that this time, the Indian army had not emerged from its barracks. It was in a COVID lockdown. And what happened was that suddenly at the beginning of May, in the first week of May, it was found that the PLA had sort of changed direction in their exercise and moved into the Indian side of the line of actual control at multiple points. The first place where this happened was in the Galwan Valley and in Hot Springs. These are marked towards the center of the map in front of you. There were sort of patrol confrontations from either side, except that the Chinese were in much larger numbers and the Indian side came off second best. There was no firing, there was no shooting, there was no violence, but it was evident that the Chinese were there in unusually large numbers. About 12 days later, at the Pangongso, which is a picturesque lake, it was on one of the slides that I showed you a little earlier, there was a confrontation, a patrol confrontation, and the Chinese, who were in large numbers there, actually beat up the Indian patrols pretty badly. There were about 72 soldiers hospitalized, and it became evident that this is picking up momentum. At mid-May, Chinese troops incursions also took place in Chushul, and while this was happening, about 2,000 kilometers away in Sikkim, in India's northeast, there was also Chinese incursions there. And it became evident that this was happening on a large front. This was something that was cause for concern. In the second week of June, the Chinese also came in Depsang, and it quickly became evident that something big was happening. Now, this is not for the first time that incursions are taking place on either side, let's be frank. The Chinese cross over to where they believe the line of control is located, the Indians cross over to their side, except that there were four big differences this time. The first was that the Chinese were coming and ingressing on a very large frontage, not just multiple fronts in Ladakh, but also 2,000 kilometers away in Sikkim. So there was an element of higher level coordination at work clearly over here. The other difference this time was that the Chinese were not just in squad strength or platoon strength, which is the norm for patrols in this area. They were there in battalion strength, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 soldiers at each point, completely outnumbering the Indians. The other big difference was that they were not coming, doing their normal patrol, doing a bit of jostling and shoving, and then heading back to their line of, across the line of actual control to their own side. They were here to stay. They were pitching up tents, they were digging defenses, they were siting bunkers, they were siting heavy weapons. So there was that big difference. And the last big difference was that there were unprecedented levels of brutality on the Chinese side. The violence levels were high. There were hospitalizations, there were serious injuries on the Indian side. So all these things put together clearly painted a picture of something big brewing, something sort of unusual happening from the Chinese side. And the Indian government was in denial up to this point. The belief was that, something unusual has happened, but maybe the Chinese will just get up and go. So the Indian government was in denial. It was rebutting any reports that were coming out of these events that were taking place, and the Chinese continued to stay. If any further information or indication was needed that things were going really bad, it took place on the 15th of June at Galwan in the Galwan River, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a brutal face-to-face battle with the Chinese using clubs, sticks, stones, pushing each other over cliffs. This was an unarmed combat taking place. If you don't count, primitive clubs and sticks as weapons. So when this happened, when 20 Indian soldiers were killed, it quickly became apparent that this is something that cannot be withheld any longer from the Indian public. Then, round about the end of August, to be precise, on the 30th of August, the morning of 30th of August, the Chinese came out into the south bank of the Pangong Lake also. You'll see two lakes over here on your slide. The northern one is the Pangong Lake. The southern one is the Spangur Lake. And the line coming down from north to south in the center of your screen is the Chinese version of the line of actual control. To the right of that, you'll see another dotted line that fades off to the right of the screen. That's the Indian version of the line of actual control. But on the heights that you see along the Chinese line of actual control, the Indian side moved on to some of those heights, confronted the Chinese, and the heights that you see, 0.5167, Razangla, and so on, were occupied by the Indians. Now, this is the first time during this crisis that the Indian side started showing signs of aggression and fight back. So far, all the Indians were doing was building up troops. By now, about 45,000 troops had been built up on either side at the various flashpoints that we talked about earlier. And the other noteworthy thing from the Indian side, besides the first show of aggression, was that they were using Tibetan soldiers of the Special Frontier Force. This is a sort of an escalatory step, it was regarded as, at least from the Chinese side, that they were using Tibetan renegades, as it were, against the Chinese. So this was the situation broadly that took place, and dialogue was taking place by this time. There were 7 rounds of military-to-military talks that had taken place. The National Security Advisor of India, who was the special representative of his government in political dialogue, had talked to Wang Yi, the Chinese special representative. The foreign ministers had met in Russia on the sidelines of the SCO meeting, but there was nothing really happening. And 2 or 3 days ago, the Chinese side indicated that their version of the line of actual control, which they regarded as their territory, was the 1959 version of the line of control. Now, this line of control and the different versions is a whole different kettle of fish. And let me quickly try and take you through some of the sort of key lines of actual control that took place. Let's not talk about the blue line that you see and the green line that loops through it. Those were British era borders that were drawn. The first line of actual control that was presented by the Chinese was in 1956. And this was reaffirmed by Premier Chou En-lai in 1959 as the correct boundary. And this is the boundary that the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry 2 or 3 days ago said that this is what China regards as the boundary. This is shown in the map as that dotted line that you see. There are dots and dashes in some lines, and there is one line that is pure dots. That's the line of actual control on the 1959 LAC, let me call it, that the Chinese spokesperson affirmed 2 days ago. However, there is also the Chinese claim line of 1960 that you see to the south of that one, which is a dash line. that loops slightly to the east of the red line, which is the line of actual control. So that is the other line that moved forward into India compared to the 1959 line. And it seems to me, after studying and correlating the intrusions that took place by the Chinese with these two different lines, the 1959 line and the 1960 line, that while the Chinese are affirming the 1959 line as the line of as the actual border at present, the intrusions have taken place up to the 1960 line, and that seems to be the de facto line that the Chinese are regarding as the border as of now. So this is the position right now on the ground. Let me quickly sort of address one or two questions before I hand over to Yun. What are the Chinese intentions? That's the biggest question on everyone's mind in New Delhi. Now, Chinese analysts have said that it is India that has started off this round of escalation. India has taken advantage of the COVID preoccupation by China, the sort of attention deficit to the border that had taken place as a consequence of COVID. And they started building infrastructure to take advantage of China's preoccupation. I would point out in response to that this does not really hold good. The infrastructure that is key cause for concern for China, the road from Darbuk, Shyok to Daulat Beg Oldi, you see Daulat Beg Oldi to the north at the Karakoram Pass here, and the road roughly follows the red alignment of the line of actual control, has been in the making for some 20 years now. It is not a new element. It is not something that has taken the Chinese by surprise or sort of been popped by the Indians at the Chinese. This is something that has been crawling along painfully for 20 years and was in fact completed in the autumn of last year. A major bridge was inaugurated by the Indian Defense Minister and the road was declared open. The second point I would make here, which sort of devalues this Chinese infrastructure concern, is that the infrastructure on the Chinese side is infinitely superior to the infrastructure on the Indian side. Over decades, it has been built up by the Chinese. And the Indians are, let me put it, they're making weak attempts to catch up. Now, catching up is impossible. Let's say they're making weak attempts to not let the gap increase too much beyond what it already is. Minimal connectivity is what the Indian side is seeking. So the question that comes is even closing the gap or seeking to maintain a stable gap, is that provocative? Is a Chinese infrastructure advantage the natural order of things as far as China is concerned? Now, this is such an outrageous proposition in Delhi's viewpoint that they don't believe that infrastructure advantage or infrastructure building by the Indian side is a key reason for China's sort of incursions across the line of actual control. Insecurity cannot be the reason. So that leaves two political reasons. One is India's August 5th move, August 5th, 2019, when it changed the status, the political status of Jammu and Kashmir, and made Ladakh into a union territory. It divided the state up into two union territories, basically. The change of status of Ladakh is being viewed by China as a provocative act. That is a distinct possibility in my view. The other sort of objective could be that China is grabbing an opportunity to underline the power hierarchy in Asia. That would mean a fourfold objective: to remind India of its place, to display to India's neighbors, the smaller countries of South Asia, who calls the shots. China does, not India. To demonstrate to Pakistan China's support, which is the Iron Brotherhood needs servicing from time to time. And finally, to show America the limitations of its partner. It's what China regards as America's cat's paw in South Asia. So these could be four possible objectives as a sort of reminder of the power hierarchy. Now for India, what are the options? Backing down is impossible. Delhi has failed to sell the narrative that nothing much is happening on the line of actual control. The Indian public is sort of spoiling for retaliation. There are domestic political compulsions, such as the elections that are coming up in the state of Bihar. And India, sort of, in a way, is looking to Modi to take stern steps, to take muscular steps, in conformity with his muscular nationalism, the politics that he has played for the last several years. So in a sense, Modi is bound to take some action. He's a victim of his own politics of muscular nationalism. Now that raises the question, is India doomed to fight a war that it cannot win? I don't believe that is the case. After initially being taken by surprise, caught short on the line of actual control, I think the Indian buildup has stabilized the situation over there. India is not taking recourse to frontally attacking Chinese positions or to pushing them out by force. So that escalatory behavior is not visible on the ground as yet. The Indian tactics basically involve blocking the Chinese, flanking them, preventing further ingress, and so on. So what seems likely to take place is a continuation of deployment by both sides through the winter. That's a brutal climatic prospect over here. Temperatures go down to minus 20 degrees. There's a huge wind chill factor. Winter stocking is sort of required because areas get cut off, battalion locations, company locations get cut off. It's a whole ball game that India is pretty good at, because it's done this over the years, both against Pakistan and against China. So India is better at it than China. China will have some catching up to do in learning the ropes of this game. So a two-sided winter deployment, I think I'll conclude by saying, would not be a defeat. It would be a stalemate for India. From the Chinese perception, a stalemate would constitute a defeat. So that's where the situation lies right now. I'll leave it there and I'll sort of hand over to Yun for her presentation. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Ajay, for that very comprehensive overview of the events this year, at least from the Indian perspective. Before I go into my presentation, I think there are a couple of questions that the Indians and Chinese have fundamentally different opinion about. And the first one is, who started it? Is the Chinese action premeditated? And the Chinese view is that the focus that triggered the incident on May 2nd was the infrastructure development or the road construction by the Indian side. And the Indian side counter-argues that China had been planning on this. And the one piece of evidence that we have seen most circulated is that China was hosting military exercises on the Tibetan plateau before May, and China was able to divert some of the troops to exit Qing. So I was very keen on this point. I was combing through the reports of the PLA exercises since the beginning of this year, and I think the biggest one was in January, and it was a full mobilization on the Tibetan plateau, but it seems to be too early for the troop diversion to happen, and wait till May. And then after the incidents at the beginning of May, there were also troop deployment mobilized from inside China, inland province of Hubei province to Tibet. But so if the Indian timeline is that China was premeditating this, and China was diverting troops from the military exercises to exit Qing, and especially to the Galvan Valley, I think some substantive evidence, for example, like photos or satellite pictures, would be more persuasive to make that argument. And in some way, to debate as to who started it is almost a chicken or egg question. Do we have chicken first, or do we have egg first? So, for example, I think the Chinese have also come up with their long list of counter-argument. So in 2019, the Indian side completed DBO road, and earlier this year, the DBO road became formally operational. So is that change of status quo? Or like Ajay just mentioned, the Indian government revoked the Article 370 and established the Ladakh Union Territory in August last year. And the maps that issued by the Indian authorities since then have included Aksai as a part of the Ladakh Union Territory. And this was also confirmed by the statement by the Ministry of Home Affairs. So would that constitute changing of status quo? So I think the debate as for who started it is an endless question. Another question or another statement that we often hear from the Indian side is that, well, India has been building roads in this area for a very long time. So why would China have a problem this year? Well, that's an interesting statement. It's almost like saying if we're doing something for a very long time and we keep doing it, it makes it right. But I think coming to territorial disputes, that's hardly going to be the case, and it's hardly a position that the Chinese will be willing to accept. Because if that is a logic, then the Chinese reclamation of artificial island in the South China Sea would legitimately confer China sovereignty and the control of the maritime territory in that region. And that is certainly something that the international community has not agreed with. So if that is a logic, I think that India has been doing this, so therefore China should be fine with it. I think then in Beijing, that logic would be reversed, that if India's perception is that it can consolidate legitimacy through repeating or advancing infrastructure, then there's all the more reason for China to take actions to stop it. And it also depends on where the road construction is taking place. So in the Chinese view, they still believe that the Indian authority is still following the forward policy of the Nehru period. So like, for example, the mud road that India was constructing earlier in the spring close to the Galvan Valley, and the bridges that India was trying to build around the Finger Four area of the Pangong Lake, those are regarded as encroaching or inching forward towards what China believes to be China's legitimate territory. So this argument that India has been doing this, therefore it is okay, is unlikely to fly in the deliberation with the Chinese side. And another argument that we hear is that the infrastructure that India is building around the line of actual control is already lagging behind the infrastructure that China has built around the same area. Therefore, India is only playing catching up. I think that's a very legitimate question, because to me the origin of the clashes that we saw this year is indeed this arms race surrounding infrastructure development by both sides, because both sides are trying to use infrastructure development to strengthen and enhance their tactical advantage, which in turn, in the view of both sides, will translate into strategic advantage eventually in both the holding of the territory and also in the future political diplomatic negotiations, if there is going to be any. So to this end, my argument actually has been that the Chinese infrastructure development had been enhanced since the introduction of the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you look at China's 13th five-year plan, there's a very clear stipulation that China is going to, or China has been, instructed to advance road constructions from its frontier provinces outward. And India is one of the 5 strategic directions that the 13th five-year plan has pointed out. So I do agree that the Chinese infrastructure is lagging behind nobody. But still, coming to the infrastructure arms race in this disputed region, it's probably less about what you build, but about where you build it. That if the infrastructure that's being constructed is perceived by the other side as intruding into their side of the perceived line of actual control, then that's going to create problems. So like Ajay mentioned, that this line of actual control is really the source of a lot of problems. And first, I think on the question of the whether this is a standoff in the Himalayas or a standoff in the coral columns, there are three sectors of the disputed border between China and India. So the largest piece is on the eastern side. So that's Arunachal Pradesh. That's what the Chinese call the southern Tibet. That's the Himalaya range. And the western side, where we're seeing more problem now, is in between Ladakh and Aksai, and that is in the Karakoram range. But I think if you compare these two different areas or the two different sectors, one problem is that the line of actual control is more confirmed or consolidated in the eastern sector because of the strategic importance, because of the troops that have always been stationed there. And in comparison, the western sector suffers this uninhabitable environment in the winter season. So that creates room for imagination and room for advancement every spring when the troops from two sides both come back to the front line, and both sides want to push forward what they believe to be the line of actual control. And there's a problem that essentially there's no mutually agreed line of actual control between China and India. So we always hear, because I had many field interviews with the Chinese as for what their perception about this issue is. And when I raised the issue that while the Indians have been insisting that there is a mutually agreed consensus about where the line of actual control actually is, and actually there are these different points along the LAC that the Indian side insists that China has accepted. I think the Chinese reaction is put it in writing. That when did we ever put it in writing that this is a consensus over the mutually agreed line of actual control? So it seems that in the Indian description, this agreement about the LAC has always been verbal, and not being able to confirm that from the Chinese side, and that's another problem with the delineation of the line of actual control. So, well, historically, China has consistently stick to the LAC of 1959, and the Indian side sticks to the LAC of 1962. And actually, before the war of 1962, that would be the LAC of September 8 of 1962, because in the following 2 to 3 months, the line of actual control dramatically changed because of the result of the war. So the Chinese argue that the territory between these two LACs were unjustly occupied by India, and this was the exact words from Zhou Enlai during those 3 years, and it was precisely the cause of the 1962 Sino-India War. So the Chinese were victorious in the 1962 war, and they believed that by that result, China had restored the LAC of 1959. And this is a perception or verdict that the Indian side never agreed to. So to this date, I think both sides have been insisting they're operating within their side of the LAC per these competing definitions. But if we look at the broader strategic context, does China want to fight a war with India? Or what does China have to gain by beating India down this year? Ajay just gave several political explanations as for what potentially could be the Chinese argument, but I think this Indian perception reflects a lack of understanding of China's strategic dilemma with India. China's dilemma with India originates from the asymmetry between China and India in their security priorities. So India sees China as its primary target, as primary security threat, while China sees India as a secondary challenge because China's national security priorities unequivocally lie in the West Pacific. Because India is not China's primary threat, and South Asia is not China's primary theater, China would prefer to save on cost and minimize military and strategic resources to be allocated on India. So if a conflict is unavoidable, China could mobilize to an overwhelming capacity to achieve a decisive victory on the battlefield. But that battlefield victory would not help to alleviate China's key security challenge, strategically in the Pacific. So the desire to avoid a two-front war in the West Pacific and South Asia at the same time has long anchored China's preference in its border dispute with India. However, I think the pattern of the border interactions with India in recent years have increasingly convinced China of India's desire to capitalize on this asymmetry and imbalance in their priorities and resolve. Since the beginning of the standoff in the Galvan Valley in early May, many Indian strategists have questioned the wisdom of China and the wisdom of China's action, given China's culpability in the COVID-19, given the free fall of relations between US and China. So I think that message translates to the Chinese that this suggests an Indian conviction that because China's position is being weakened, and because India's position is being strengthened, consequently, India could expect Chinese concessions. So I think this also gets into the question as well, who really started it, and what is the perception or the misperception of each other's strategic intention in this case. And I would like to say that probably both sides' perception, at least it's a real perception on to their own decision making, and has played a significant role. And if there were indeed misunderstandings, then those misunderstandings and misperception were not really cleared during this escalation of tension. So what are we going to see from now on? I think unlike the Doklam standoff in 2017, China has chosen not to concede this time. Because if you remember back in 2017, when India declared a victory, there were also this observation that China eventually is a paper tiger. And if China's bluff is called, then China would back off. So I think the Chinese has made a determination this time not to repeat that mistake or not to that experience. So in fact, China has pushed forward its position in multiple locations in the Western sector. While India demands a return to a pre-May status quo ante, the Chinese are holding on to a new status quo at a fait accompli. Because China has claimed that it was reacting to India's first moves in the Galvan Valley in the spring, and China was compelled to respond to a perceived act of Indian aggression. So this, for external observers, this position, if this is indeed the Chinese argument, then this position would imply that China should restore the status quo ante instead of a new fait accompli. Strategically, this raises a suspicion that China is aiming for the line of the actual control, not only back to the 1959, but also back to the end of the 1962 war. Although no official Chinese sources have ever confirmed that position. Even if it is their position, I don't think China is going to confirm. Tactically, the rejection of the status quo ante is best understood through the lens of a pattern of China's reactive assertiveness and Xi. That the logic is China's reaction to perceive the transgression must be punitive in nature. Therefore, the punishment must exceed the original offense in order to increase the cost of future similar transgressions. So there's a pattern of that behavior in China's recent record, especially in regards to the changing of the status quo in the waters surrounding the disputed Senkaku Diaoyu Islands by regularizing the dispatch of Chinese government vessels as a reaction to Tokyo's nationalization of the island back in 2012. So I think the difficult question is now presented to India, that what is India's strategic options, that if India cannot reverse the status quo to a pre-May status quo ante, and China is refusing to budge. I think some people have hoped that as winter progresses, then both sides probably will withdraw because of the weather conditions will deteriorate. But that is certainly not something that we have seen in the past couple of months, the past couple of weeks. So I think we're more likely to see this standoff along the Galvan Valley, and more importantly along the Pangongzhou Lake going into the winter this year. And this is going to create significant human and logistical difficulties, I think, for both sides to deal with. So the end game is not near within sight, and we probably will have to see this escalation or see this type of standoff to become a regular event, at least in the western sector of the disputed border. I will stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both for a very comprehensive sort of laying out the issues. What I'm going to do is to ask each of you two questions, two sets of questions, one tactical, one more strategic. So tactically, now winter is, as Yunsun and Ajay, you both said, is now coming. First snows have started to fall. It's going to be 20 degrees to 30 degrees below Celsius in the nights over here. You have close to 100,000 troops, 45, 50,000 on both sides. What further tactical moves either side do you think, or the Indian side, Ajay, could make? Soon, in sort of your case on the Chinese side, that is it going to be just a stalemate, or do you actually foresee either mistakes or otherwise that this could spiral out of control over winter? Ajay, you first, and then Yun.
That question.
Sorry, Ajay, I think you're frozen.
First of all, I would sort of present the point that the tactical challenge is for troops to survive in those conditions. The fighting comes second. The first and most important challenge is to stay alive, which means a huge logistic buildup. Up of fuel, living accommodations, the construction of bunkers, the bringing up of weaponry that will function through those extreme cold conditions. Human. All of this, not just in the Siachen Glacier, but in many high altitude.
If you put your video off, sort of breaking off. If you put your video off, it might be come through more clearly.
Okay, is my audio better now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I was to have the measures in place for soldiers to survive, and only then do we come to the question of tactical gains, of actual fighting, of giving in the front line. In winter, you need very few troops to actually hold objective. So you will actually see thinning out from both sides. The numbers that you actually have on the ground right now will probably not continue into winter. Both sides will sort of withdraw the bulk of their troops and leave just enough to ensure that the status quo is maintained, that the other side doesn't make any gains. But that is now, given the positions taken by both sides, the hardline political positions, it seems almost a given. Neither side can afford to pull out the territory that has been vacated. So no matter no matter what the costs in lives and in material and in manpower, I think that this seems to be the sort of the order of the day now. The Indian side has already begun stocking. I have no doubt that the Chinese would be doing it as well. They are at an advantage in this given their superior infrastructure. But once you actually leave the network of roads and tracks, and eventually mountain warfare is all about the heights. The advantage of roads and tracks becomes less apparent. So both sides have extremely difficult days ahead. I don't see too much of give and take. I don't see too much of actual fighting in the winter, but certainly there will be casualties on both sides of the results of high altitude and climate.
Do you think that in May, China envisaged that it would have tens of thousands of troops sitting at 30 degrees below zero in January?
That is a good question. I think these are all in relative terms, right? So if China and India are having a standoff in this mountain regions, then China only needs to outlast India, or China only needs to do better than India, because this is a two-side or two-actor game. And at least in my research, I don't get the sense that the Chinese are thinking they're going to lose in such a standoff, because well, China has more resources, both in terms of financial resources and potentially for more military resources. And if you compare the current political situation, China has put COVID-19 under control, and the Indian new emerging COVID-19 cases keeps growing. And the Chinese economy, whether we believe in their data, the Chinese economy has shown signs of recovery. So they're achieving a slight positive growth by the second quarter. And the Indian economy suffered a 23.9% contraction of the GDP in the second quarter. So I think if this becomes a longer, prolonged war or prolonged standoff of attrition, then I think China, as a side that has more resources, does not believe it is in a disadvantage in this interaction. And honestly, for the Chinese policy proposals, the policy option that China has, we hear two options. We hear three possibilities or three options. The first one is China should be the first mover. China should fight a war to end all wars in the future with India. And if China is intending to taking on Taiwan, then China has more reason to tie up the loose end in the southwestern border. So that will require China to take the strategic initiative to wipe out this problem, at least for the time being. Second option is what the Chinese have been doing, and I think China will continue to do, which is the second mover advantage or second mover assertiveness. That China will not initiate a military conflict with India, but China will react extremely assertively to whatever action that they perceive to be coming from India as aggressive. And the result of that is going to be, at least in the Chinese estimate, it will be very similar to the 1962 war. And the third option is the Chinese supreme art of war, which is winning without fighting. That if China believes that China's economy is going to, the gap between China and India over their comprehensive national power is only going to grow larger, then China could wait to a future date when India finally realizes that it cannot surpass China. So at that time, India will, in the Chinese mind, India will become more pragmatic about the solution of the border dispute. So I think these three options are being circulated in China, and given the border interaction, one of them could gain more momentum down the road. But currently, I see the Chinese strategic option and the choice that they have made is to let's keep the standoff, let's continue to check India in this region, and let's wait and see what India action will be and will react to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Yun. Ajay, if we sort of think sort of beyond winter, in your remarks you said that China's actions sort of reveal the holes in India's military preparedness, and it has particularly embarrassed the Prime Minister's self-cultivated image of being strong on security. What do you think are his and his government's strategic options, and which ones do you think they're most likely to pursue?
The question that you have posed would sort of imply that you start at the strategic level and then structure your tactics and your operations downwards to conform and to achieve those strategic objectives. But the reality in this case, Devesh, is that India is already presented with a bunch of tactical imperatives and tactical conditions that it has had no choice in influencing, and it therefore has to take it onwards from there. I think the simple position, the summation of India's position right now is that they are at a tactical disadvantage, at a tactical sort of second mover position on the ground, and they have to recover that position. If they don't recover that position, they have to at least make sure that the position does not get any worse. Now, all of this must tie in with domestic political compulsions that the government faces on a day-to-day basis, which is, as you just mentioned, the cultivation of the image of muscularity, the perception that India is not bowing down to China in any way, the perception that India is fighting what is its own and taking that very seriously. Now, all of this, as you implied at the beginning of your question, is being done with minimal resources, is being done with a military that has been sort of denied funding for a significant period of time. And that doesn't make the task any easier from the Indian perspective. But at the same time, you know, it's tempting to calculate tactical positions and tactical outcomes in the context of national resources, national growth rates, and so on. But when you actually come to a face-off on a high altitude mountain, you find that national resources sometimes don't easily allow themselves to be applied at that point. And then the tactical imperatives become as important as the strategic, if not more. So that's the position from the Indian point of view as at this point, Devesh. There are strategic and domestic political compulsions that drive India in a particular direction, in a direction of staying firm, holding on, not backing off in any way. And at the same time, there are the tactical realities that are sort of constraining it. But there is also the tactical sort of experience and advantage of the Indian side in a lot of high altitude warfare. And there's a sort of belief that I get from the Indian military that they can hold their own against the Chinese, at least in the circumstances that currently exist.
Thanks, Ajay. I'm somewhat, next week, the Indian foreign minister is going to be going to Japan for a meeting of the Quad. When this idea was floated about 15 years ago, India had been actually very, very hesitant and was very circumspect. China was very critical, and Indian strategic thinkers were very divided. It's unambiguously clear that China's actions, it has lost India for the next quarter century. I mean, I have no doubt about it. It doesn't matter what your explanations are, but that is a reality. And it is also a reality that the very thing that China professed to wanted to avoid, which is the Quad, will now come to happen. And so the puzzle is, why would China want to create the very security dilemma which you alluded to, which is the Western side, the Pacific side, and link it with India, when India actually did not want to? But more broadly, to put it in a larger context, right? Last year or two, it's been very clear, whether it's Australia, whether it's Europe, the United States, of course, Taiwan, Hong Kong, there's a much stronger sense of a certain belligerence, a certain assertiveness on China's part. The wolf warrior, diplomacy, etc. To isolate this from a broad pattern of changing Chinese assertiveness, which is, of course, what is driving the Quad. I mean, it's very, very clear. And from a strategic point of view, why would China undertake actions that would lead countries to create alliances against it, when in fact, it would be served much better to sort of divide and rule, which is the classic old thing. You know, why do you want to get your adversaries to link up? And that's been a puzzle. And for many people, these actions that you were referring to them in rather isolation from the broader changes of Chinese behavior that is being observed in across the world, right? And so I want you to try to help us understand that.
Well, thank you, Professor. I think that's a very insightful question, and indeed a question that has been puzzling for a lot of observers. I think this has something to do with the nature of the interaction between India and China, and also the nature of the another side of asymmetry between Chinese demand for India and Indian demand for China. And I think the most hawkish people in China would argue, especially, for example, the PLA, they would argue that there's no love lost between China and India anyway. That even at the peak days that India was debating as for whether to join the Indo-Pacific strategy, India was still perceiving China as the largest security threat, and there's no doubt. And if the perception in India is indeed that China's position is weakened, therefore China should make concessions on the border or on the border dispute, then for the Chinese that will translate into an Indian conviction of its position of strength and a conviction of China's position of weakness. Therefore, it would not be perceived as China's goodwill, but instead the resulting compromise made by China will be only interpreted as a result of India's improved international status. And by that logic, India is not going to back off, but instead India will make even more demand on China. So I agree with you that China's aversion to a conflict with India should naturally lead to some level of accommodation of India demands. But I think Beijing also finds that accommodation exceedingly difficult because for China, key concessions such as a border settlement are irreversible. They're hard commitments. While everything that India can deliver in return, such as its neutrality between the United States and China in the event of a great power conflict, is ephemeral and can easily be reversed. So while New Delhi sees addressing these issues as a prerequisite for India to trust China, Beijing does not believe for a second that relinquishing its leverage will in any way stop India from hostile actions down the road, especially given their clashing regional visions, the structural conflicts between the two regional powers in subcontinent of South Asia. So these are, I would say, pretty logical calculations from the Chinese perspective. And like you mentioned, the Indo-Pacific strategy has exacerbated this dilemma for China. So this strong signal of strategic alignment between US and India based on shared democratic values and regional visions is creating this challenge for China as to how to deal with it. And I think China's immediate reaction was to show kindness to India and try to improve relations. And that's why we saw the Wuhan summit in the April of 2018, which was a couple of months after Doklam standoff, and it's quite contradictory to Xi Jinping's strategic personality. So while China's most immediate instinct is to enhance cooperation with India in order to preempt such a US-India alignment, Beijing is fraught with the fact that India is being enticed and potentially enmeshed by the offers that Washington has made. So I think for Beijing, even if India is trying to maintain its strategic autonomy, the US offer of security cooperation and political alignment has inevitably inflated India's perception of its power equilibrium vis-a-vis China. As such, China interprets India's assertiveness in the disputed border region as a result of the emboldenment by the Indo-Pacific strategy. So in a way, I think India's improved international status, when translated into behaviors and perceptions about the disputed border, has in fact enhanced the Chinese pushback or the Chinese threat perception about India. So and this this asymmetry in terms of their perception of the external environment, the asymmetry of the nature of the key demands China and India have for each other. I think both have become the foundation of China's decision making, at least for this time. And when China looked down the road about the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think most of the content that China sees as substantive are coming from bilateral front. So it's between US and India, between US and Japan, and between US and Australia. But Quad or Indo-Pacific strategy as a multilateral framework has not produced as much substantive content or substantive challenge to what China's national interests are. So I think in that sense, the Chinese would like to challenge that, well, for India to seriously align its position with the United States, India will have to reconsider its strategic autonomy, its multi-coalition, and its equidistance diplomacy. And that will first challenge India's relationship with Russia rather than India's relationship with China. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just sort of moving to some of the questions, I'll begin the first one, Ajay, which is more directed at you, which is was there an intelligence failure on the Indian part? And was it a failure of intelligence gathering or intelligence assessment? And was the failure at the military level or at the political level?
The understanding that I have is that the Indian intelligence sort of technical agencies had picked up complete details of the activities by the PLA across the line of actual control in the month of April. And that was fed through the official channels up to the higher decision-making machinery, which reached the assessment, clearly now a flawed assessment, that the Chinese would not sort of take advantage of the absence of the Indian troops due to COVID, that this was in some way a moment of sort of a shared challenge between the two countries, where they would not take advantage of each other at this point in time. And therefore, there was no need for the Indian side to reinforce and to bring up troops to the border in the manner that it customarily did every year. So to sum up and sort of answer that question absolutely directly, it was a clear failure of Indian intelligence assessment, not of intelligence gathering capability.
So Yunsun, you mentioned this this sort of lack of trust. Now, there is, I think, no doubt that this incident is going to sharply amplify the mistrust between the two countries. Would it be in China's interest, if its relationship with the United States continues to worsen, to have a large adversary with such poor relations on its on such a large border?
Well, thank you, Professor. I think that's a great question, and I think that has been the strategic dilemma in the back of the mind of the Chinese strategic decision makers for a very long time. That that can China make the necessary accommodation or the concession to India in exchange for a relatively stable or friendly relationship with India in light of the great power competition with the United States. I think their preference is to do that, but when the price tag is posted that it requires China to make material concessions on the ground, I think the Chinese Communist Party's answer is no, they cannot make that concession. Because you could say that both issues challenge China severely. And the first one is more of an external challenge of China's international status and China's power equilibrium, the position China is in terms of the power equilibrium vis-a-vis the United States. But the second one will pose a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party internally. And we all know that our politics are domestic. So for China to make that a foreign policy concession at the cost of their domestic legitimacy, I think that is almost unthinkable for China. So I think the Chinese reaction is going to be that it will not make that accommodation that India desires. I think China will put up a fight, or at least put up a standoff vis-a-vis India in the front line. And the worst comes to worst, I think the Chinese have a problem of two-front war with Taiwan in the East Asia. But India also has a problem of two-front war, right? And some would even argue it's a 2.5 front war. So with Pakistan, and with also the rebel groups or the terrorist organizations in other parts of India's periphery. So I think for the Chinese, when they do the strategic calculation and see if China is going to be the absolute loser in this game, they don't think so. Thank you.
Thank you. Ajay, this is a question from Professor Vipin Narang at MIT. And so he asks, does India have any good options between now and mid-November to compel Chinese withdrawal from the pieces of territory it has bitten off, either head-on or through asymmetrically building leverage elsewhere? It seems that the agreement to, quote, stop sending more troops to the front line by India ties India's hands on a counteroffensive, and that India is content to seek a freeze to get through the winter. If that is all the case, what are the long-term consequences is India is forced to accept this new status quo and Chinese fate comply? Particularly, how will this shape its future relations with China?
So there's a tactical dimension to this question, and Vipin's also asked the strategic question of India's largest policy options to deal with the situation. At the strategic level, there are multiple options that India has. However, it is absolutely clear by now that India is deliberately seeking not to escalate the situation. There is a sort of a contested decision making in this particular realm, because there's a strong body of opinion that says that you cannot allow this situation of disadvantage to continue to prevail, and that India has to sort of squeeze China on other fronts in areas where it is not at a disadvantage as it is in the ones that it currently faces a setback in. This school of thought urges escalation on the Indian side, the employment of India's strike corps, mountain strike corps, the employment of a large number of special forces that it has created for this purpose. But if that had to be done, Devesh and Vipin, it would have been done by now, is the way I read the situation. For now, India is seeking to act responsibly, not to escalate the situation, to, if necessary, go through with a winter deployment. It's not such a huge big deal as compared to a shooting war on the front lines. So that is how things stand on the tactical front right now. On the strategic front, I mean, it's remarkable how much divergence there is in Beijing's view of the situation and in New Delhi's view. Yun has sort of given Beijing's viewpoint very succinctly, but I would also point out that from New Delhi's perspective, there has been a strong sense of sort of reticence and autonomy and not falling into the American camp, of sort of being autonomous in its dealings, of catering to Chinese sensibilities and sensitivities. And as you mentioned in your last question to Yun, all of that is completely out the window now. Even through this particular crisis, there have been at least 4 sort of occasions that I am aware of when the Americans have offered support to the Indian side. New Delhi has declined that support, except in sort of certain fields like intelligence and so on, and assessment. So India continues to try and walk a sort of an autonomous line. But to answer Vipin's question, I don't think that will be feasible much longer. I think inevitably India will be sliding into the United States camp. Maybe it will be almost sort of unapparent, this change as it takes place. But like you said, the Quad is going to happen. The alliance or the partnership with the Americans is going to deepen. And China will possibly realize at a later stage that, the Indian reticence was possibly to their advantage rather than their disadvantage.
Yoon, there's a question. Sorry, there's a question for you. You sort of pointed to Chinese apprehensions, lack of trust, that India will, if push comes to shove, it will always side with the US in a sense. Now, the question is that if China sees that apprehension, why does China not see India's apprehension that China has consistently supported Pakistan, which it knows has such a bad relationship with India? And how would you see Indians interpret China's support for Pakistan?
I think that's a very interesting question, because it almost put India, Pakistan, China, and United States on the same platform, almost with no power discrepancy, and to say that that China could align with Pakistan, then India can align with the United States. If I can summarize that perception.
So
right?
The point is that it's not that China can align. China has aligned, and it has demonstrated its alignment for the past few decades.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, so that is already a matter of record. It's not a matter of supposition. Whereas the alliance between India and the US is a matter of supposition. It's not a matter of record.
Well, that's a very interesting proposition, because I think for China, I have no illusion about China's intention or hegemonic intention in the Asia region. And I always regard China's policy in South Asia as being anchored on this desire for a balance of power to check India. So within the South Asia region, China aligns with the smaller countries in South Asia in order to check India. And then in Asia region, China is very alert that India could align its position with the United States in order to counterbalance China. Then on the higher global level, going beyond Asia on the global level, we see this Chinese desire to align with India again, because both India and China are argued to be emerging markets, the rising power, both belong to the developing country bloc. So therefore, China and India should act together vis-a-vis the global north as the leaders of the global south. So I think this intrinsic conflict has always existed in China's policy towards India, just like the earlier conflict that I described, where China wants to maintain a good relationship with India, but on the other hand, cannot afford to pay the price if the price tag that India posed is indeed that to settle the border according to India's preference. And I think this issue was particularly illustrated to the Chinese South Asia policy community when Modi first stepped into power, and he started this list of the issue diplomacy, as the Chinese call it. That Modi had a long list of issues for China to make compromises on, and this included the designation of the designation of Pakistani organizations as UN, as terrorist organizations at the UN. This includes the membership of the NSG group. This includes the pilgrimage visa issue for the Indians to visit Tibet. So when the Chinese look at the record of negotiation with India, I think the Chinese fear is whenever China agrees to something, India will come back with a longer list for China to make further concessions. That you agree to this, maybe you can also agree to this list of things. So I think that fear has pretty much anchored the Chinese anxiety when they deal with India. But coming to the global alliance issue or the global power equilibrium, India does have this tradition of strategic autonomy, right? And this desire, I think this assertion in the Indian society that we are not going to become US ally. Our position is not to align with anybody. Our position is to maximize our own policy choices and the flexibility. I think that is probably the internal challenge for India to make that decision about alignment with the United States. If you look at the current options for India, India cannot advance against China, and India cannot back off from China. So the only option I would like to argue is for India to enhance the external support, the external alignment to boost its own negotiation position vis-a-vis China. But is India able to do that? And I'm really curious as for what Prime Minister Modi has done since the beginning of the Galvan Valley crisis to enhance India's alignment or India's relationship with the United States. Thank you.
There's another question like for you, which says that if China has sort of written off India in this sense, then there is no role for diplomacy anymore? Because you seem to have said, well, you know, they've basically made up their mind. This is what India is, etc., etc. So if both sides say, well, that's what the other side is, there's no room for diplomacy left. Because that seems to be an implication of your argument.
Well, diplomacy is not a goal, right? Diplomacy is a tool. Diplomacy is an instrument to pursue the perceived national interest for all countries.
Right.
So I would say that, I'm sorry, Professor.
No, please.
Oh, thank you. So I would say that in this case, we have seen the meeting between Jaishankar and Wang Yi in Moscow back in September 10th, and saw the 5-point consensus that two foreign ministers produced. And has that stopped the frontline soldiers and troops from continuing their standoff and stopped either country from reinforcing their logistical supply and troop deployment on the front line? I think the answer is no. So I think diplomacy is a way that both countries have implemented quite adaptedly to avoid crisis and to avoid a military conflict that, honestly, in my opinion, neither side wants to engage in. So I think diplomacy has a very large role to play, but diplomacy by itself is a means, it's not an end. Thank you.
Thanks. So Ajay, there's a question like for you. Basically, given that the Prime Minister had built up his reputation as a sort of a security hawk, and the reality that is pretty much the awareness in India that, you know, that Chinese troops have come into the lines, within the lines that were claimed by India, and that his government has been found weak. What do you think might be his actions going forward to try and regain his sort of credentials as a security hawk?
First of all, Devesh, I think that the pressure on Modi is limited. It is not sort of overbearing at this point in time, for the simple reason that the country is so polarized in its political orientation that half the country, or let's say 45% of the country, would believe that Modi can do no wrong even in the face of a China debacle, whereas another similar number of people, or maybe a few less people, would believe that Modi can do no right. So the way that the government has actually played this intrusion and the denials and the sort of stepping back and the treading softly approach that it has adopted has so far allowed the government to sort of say that the Chinese have done only limited incursions and the Indian side has managed to sort of nullify the effect of them, and the situation is more or less under control. So given that, the pressure on Modi is only limited to be able to take a sort of what I would call a rash step against the Chinese. Right now, the belief in the corridors of power in New Delhi are that the situation is being handled adequately. There is no real political downside that we can see at this point in time, unless it transforms into a debacle of some kind. Changing the status quo on the other hand, and changing the approach that the Indian government has brought to the table to handle this crisis might, on the other hand, result in something going seriously wrong, in the situation escalating or inflaming, and that might be a downside itself. So right now, I don't think the sort of Modi government or the Prime Minister himself is under a huge amount of pressure to display his security hawk credentials. I think the belief is that it's more or less being done and handled in an appropriate manner.
Junson, there's a question for you. If US-China relations continue to deteriorate and move towards a quasi-Cold War situation, which cannot be ruled out at this stage, how would that reshape China's relations? How would China rethink or not rethink its relations with India?
Yeah, I think that's a question that to my knowledge, that all the South Asia wonks in China are trying to figure out that what is its implication of this event. And I just published a piece on Global Asia earlier this week, arguing basically China might have won the battle, but China could be losing the war. That if China indeed understands that the negative international environment that it is facing, this war or this conflict or this standoff with India is not going to play out in China's favor. So that's my assessment, and I think China is not necessarily wise in doing what it has done. But I understand that that from the Chinese perspective, from the Chinese leaders' perspective, they see incentives and they see reasoning for to justify their choice. Whether that choice is a good one, I think it's too early to tell. But I think related to this concept of the new Cold War and the concept of India's alignment choices in this new Cold War, I think that's also an interesting issue to observe, because if we remember, India's choice during the Cold War was non-alignment, was not to join either side, either bloc. But arguably, China is not Soviet Union, and the problems or the level of cooperation and the level of conflict between China and India is significantly different from the relationship between India and the Soviet Union. But whether India will continue to observe its doctrine of strategic autonomy, I think is really the key question here. That it will determine where India will position itself and which partner that India will align. Maybe India will choose to align with the United States. And based on what has happened, there are pretty sound logic to that. But that will also pose a certain demand for India to adjust its current policy, including its current military doctrine, I have to say, for that to happen. And I think that's the most difficult question for India to answer.
So just an observation, and India that is now dominated by the BJP is not the India run by the Congress. Ajay, just we're running out of time, so just a last question for you, which is, what do you see, or where do you see India going if the US-China competition, let's call it, intensifies?
The US-China competition appears to be intensifying. India has been sort of acting in that context for quite a while so far. And until this sort of latest inflammation of the border took place, I think the belief in the power circles in India was that the Wuhan summit, the Mamallapuram summit, the sort of relationship between Modi and Xi Jinping, the personal dynamics and so on and so forth, the Indian government had certainly the top policymakers had deluded themselves into believing that all of this constituted a stable relationship with China, that China was sort of paying service to its Pakistan relationship, but it was also considerate of Indian interests, and so on and so forth. There was sort of nothing that signaled a sharp downswing in relations, and which therefore warranted a closening of ties with the United States. But that, I think, has changed now. The entire sort of experience of this intrusion by China and the hard line taken in the diplomatic dialogue so far, and the absolute clarity with which China is refusing to withdraw to status quo ante, is certainly going to shape Indian strategic perceptions of how it positions itself in this new Cold War. And I would be very surprised if the deliberations on India's strategic autonomy are carried out with as dispassionate a sort of approach as Yun seems to be suggesting. I think that China has taken the axe to strategic autonomy of India. I think that there is now a very, very strong belief that India needs to strengthen its alternatives, its sort of make friends with the other powers, the sort of anti-China coalition in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's the direction that India is going to go. I sort of would also remind sort of observers and listeners that non-alignment as it existed in 1962 before the war was very different from after the war. After the war, the Indians were inviting the United States to come in, to bring supplies, to fly fighter sorties from India against China, and so on and so forth. And I think that any serious debacle that takes place would again see India heading in that direction. So far, that's not happened. India is still holding its own. I think it will probably continue to do so. But certainly the larger question that you raised has to be answered, that India will inevitably swing in the direction of the US camp now.
I think it is probably too early to tell where things are going. But this is a very obviously both complex and contentious, issues. And I just want to thank both Ajay and Yun Sun to bringing a level of sobriety and a level of dispassionate analysis to these very hard questions. And I want to thank all of you who were participating and who send in their questions. I am sorry we could not get time to ask all questions to our panels, but I hope they gave you a sense of the complexities and the very different views and perceptions of the two sides. So please join me in thanking them, and we hope we can have them back maybe when the snows melt next year. So thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Yun. And I'm very happy that you both came to be part of this panel. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Devesh. Thank you, Yun.
Thank you, Ajay. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Bye-bye.